it was the dominant school in psychology, but it was overturned in the 1960s by the cognitive revolution, which showed that you could study things like emotions, memories, plans, goals, and so on. And I reject behaviorism as a restrictive philosophy that says you can't study these things or that it's unscientific to do so. Nonetheless, it is certainly true that behavior is responsive to consequences, what Skinner called the, following Thorndike, the law of effect. So it's not that that is false, just that you can't really understand how behavior is sensitive to consequences unless you know something about what the person knows and what the person wants. So I don't think that looking at the sensitivity of behavior to the environment is incompatible with a mentalistic viewpoint. In fact, I think you need the mentalistic viewpoint to predict what people will do with their circumstances.
Sebastopol, California. California, go ahead. Helps if I press the button. Go ahead.
Yes, years ago I read Benjamin Worf's book, Language, Thought, and Reality. And in it, he proposes the idea that a language both constrains or can constrain and guide conceptual thinking. I'd like your comments on that, and I'll hang up. Thank you.
Yes, this is the famous linguistic determinism hypothesis, also called the Worfian hypothesis after Benjamin Lee Worf. And I have a chapter on that in The Stuff of Thought. I think Worf went way overboard, that in saying that we think in structures made available by our native language, that some things are literally inconceivable if they can't be expressed by our language. I think that's a gross exaggeration. I think thought is prior to language. If it weren't, children would never be able to learn a language in the first place. We would never be able to change the language, and languages change all the time. We would never be able to translate from one language to another. This isn't to say that language can't influence thought, and I discuss ways in the book in which language does influence thought, certainly in the course of conversation. That's why we have language. And also, we use snatches of language as computational tools, such as when we do arithmetic and we retrieve formulas in a language that we've memorized, like 8 times 7 is 56, a little sort of tape loop that we have stored in our mind, framed in language, that's very useful in doing arithmetic. But I think there are many forms of language, of thought, that are not in language. I think there are mental images of sounds and sights and bodily sensations. I think there's an abstract sense of meaning or gist or concepts that corresponds to what a sentence means, to what makes two sentences synonymous, to what makes one sentence a translation of another in a different language, without which language would be impossible. So I think Worf went way too far.
Do you have a favorite book?
A single favorite book? Oh, of mine.
Of yours.
Oh, mine, okay.
Of yours.
I think that, it's always tempting to say the most recent one is my favorite, but I have to say How the Mind Works.
Mm-hmm.
Just
Why?
because it was so audacious. I still can barely believe that I wrote a book with that title. But it was my attempt to sum up the subject matter of my life's work and to actually put between two covers general theory of how the mind works.
Who's published most of your books?
My most recently Penguin in the United States. All of my books but one, all of my trade books but one have been published by Penguin in Britain. In the U.S., also Norton published How the Mind Works, and HarperCollins publishes both Words and Rules and The Language Instinct. But and for the time being, I'm a Penguin author.
We mentioned the Language Instinct being one of the bestsellers. What was which other book of your books have been New York Times bestsellers or bestsellers?
The Blank Slate was on the Times bestseller list for 5 weeks, and the Stuff of Thought has been on the Times bestseller list.
So not just your most recent books.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to take another break and then come back, and we will have some more phone calls and about 55 more minutes with our guest.
I've long believed in that bookshelves should be arranged in cubes. I think bookends are a nuisance. The books always flop around. And also cubes allow you to organize books by subject, which is essential if you have as many books as I do. So I got a labeler, and at some point a few years ago I discovered a place on the web that sells modular cubicle bookshelves. You can add to them up, down, sideways as your needs changed. In fact, I brought these with me from a much smaller apartment when I moved here. I'm also not only read and write a lot of books, but I'm married to someone who does, and when we got together, we merged our collections, which even added to the confusion because we're interested in many of the same topics, like philosophy, like history. So it was absolutely essential to get organized. So we have, these are more, we merged our books, but these are have a greater concentration from Rebecca than me, but we've got history of philosophy, philosophy of mind. Then we've got particular philosophers. Here we've got Spinoza. Rebecca wrote a book on Spinoza. Rousseau, Kurt Gödel. She wrote a book on Gödel. We've got existentialism over here. History of science. Then my books tend to be a little higher. I've got general science. There's medicine. Richard Dawkins has his own cube. We have books on engineering. Biography and memoir. There's a whole string of cubes.
So while we're over here, could you pull a book or two off the shelf and just tell us, ones that really you find very important or interesting that you like a lot?
Well, let's see. In fact, kind of timely. Richard Dawkins, The Selfish Gene, is, I think, one of the best trade science books ever written. Because not only is it clear and witty and stylish, but it actually had an impact in science itself. He was making a contribution both to the public understanding of science, but also offered a framework for biologists themselves to rethink what they were doing. And I suspect that this book gets more citations in the primary scientific literature than the vast majority of technical scientific papers. A book that I bought when I was an undergraduate in 1975, Noam Chomsky, Reflections on Language, that I have used ever since. It's actually quite yellow. I think this is before the era of acid-free paper, and so I might sort of self-compost one of these days. Oh, The Mountain of Names. This was a wonderful book by a journalist, Alex Shumatoff, on how names spread, how they're given, and actually using names as really more of an excuse to study the phenomenon of genealogy and kinship. So if you go back a few generations, one person's family tree inevitably overlaps with someone else's, and therefore any two people will be related. It's a phenomenon sometimes called pedigree collapse, that any person's pedigree extends outward as you go back in time until there weren't enough people to go around, in which case it collapses back upon itself. Phenomenon I first learned about from this book. Somehow it stuck in memory for several decades, and when I had to write that article, I went back to it and found exactly the annotations that I had made several decades before. These are organized by subject. This is the nonfiction side, and Rebecca is a novelist, and so whenever anyone does something, they're always an expert in what they do. I know musicians have huge record collections, and novelists have huge collections of novels. In the case of the novels, there are so many that just to have a fiction section would have been useless. So these are alphabetical. That seems very anal retentive, but it was a necessity. So here I have reference books. I've got the compact Oxford English Dictionary. I have a bunch of grammars and style manuals, books of wordplay, puns, anagrams, palindromes. Now with the web, I rely on these less than I used to. Dictionaries, the Oxford Companion to English Literature. I have to look up a literary reference. Books of quotations. Bartlett's, Isaac Asimov's Book of Science quotations. They Never Said It, a wonderful book of fake